Hi, Lisa. I'm delighted that you're joining us on VTech America today. Thank you so much for your time.
The pleasure is all mine.
Thank you. I feel that your research is crucially educational, also for the general public, specifically at this potentially historic tipping point in time. But first, I was wondering, you've had a most illustrious career. What has it been like, or what has been your experience as a woman of color rising in a biased system?
I would say that it has been it's been interesting. It's been interesting. Certainly, I am attracted to economics because of the tools, because of our toolkit, because of our ability to analyze any problem that's put before us. And I think the best economists understand the limits of those tools and the limits of data that we have not much control over, and the limits of our assumptions. And I am always at home doing that kind of analysis, so I should start there. But I would say that, economics has not reconciled its past nor its present with respect to women, black women, women of color, as we know from the climate survey. So that's what led to my New York Times op-ed in September, talking about the paucity of black women in the field. And I had been working on issues related to gender in the economics profession before that, and started working on this even more. But as director of the AEA Summer Program, obviously I'm interested in encouraging and preparing underrepresented minorities to do PhDs in economics. So this was just a particular emphasis that I was placing on black women who are severely underrepresented in economics. So I would say that we have a problem to address, and that is getting more attention. So I just think, just like in many other realms, once the data are there, it is up to us to act on those data. We also have data about the review process and journals, and it's up to us to review those processes as well. If it took 10 years for something that many are saying now is innovative to get published, I think that the review process is therefore worth revisiting too. So, the economics profession is not perfect. I've had many hurdles to overcome, but I've also seen it developing and growing, and I would prefer to be in the profession now than to have been in it earlier.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that today there is still institutionalized racism in the U.S.? And if so, what has been its effect on individuals, ethnic communities, and the U.S. economy?
So, absolutely, there's still systemic racism. We keep talking about all the disparities associated with COVID-19, for example, and all of those are rooted in systemic racism. So if we talk about the health disparities, the work disparities, African Americans and Latinos concentrated in low-wage work, that is rooted in systemic racism. The air that we breathe, the environmental racism that leads to asthma and other health conditions, that's rooted in systemic racism. So I would say certainly it is there, and it is up to us. For many of us, that is a revelation. Many of us are aware of this, and it's up to us to do something about it and get over the hurdle of calling it systemic racism and actually doing something about it, and doing something about it permanently.
Mm-hmm. And how does discrimination impact innovation and growth?
The way I saw it in my paper, and this is historically, is that discrimination via lynchings, via riots or uprisings, and via segregation laws limited African Americans' participation in the innovation economy and limited their opportunity to invent. So, that was one way in which discrimination impacted invention. Indeed, African Americans were not allowed to participate in invention in corporate labs at first. So a lot of the invention that used to be on the shoulders of individuals was being done by teams in corporate laboratories. And during that period of movement to corporate laboratories, African Americans were often not involved. For the most part, they were not involved. And my cousin Percy Julian was the first African American to head a corporate R&D lab at Glidden Industries. So that was a first. So that's I guess those are two ways that discrimination curtailed invention, not just for the country, but for these individuals. If we're talking about now there are several impediments. There is a lack of diversity in the leadership of many tech companies with respect to IPOs, with respect to founders, with respect to founders who are funded by venture capital. There's lack of diversity up and down the innovation economy, and I think that my results are instructive. This is diminishing not just innovation, but also what we expect from innovation, and that's higher living standards. So that's why we should be worried about it. We could get extra GDP per capita if we were more decided if the innovation economy welcomed everyone.
Mm-hmm. Of course, yeah, it's very frustrating. You mentioned violence, and because we've seen a shocking amount of violence against African Americans specifically, which has always existed, but it's just become more visible because of cell phone tapings and so forth. You've conducted research on the impact of violence on economic activity. What are your conclusions?
Right. The big conclusion, well, I guess there are two large ones. One is that violence does impact economic activity, and that activity that I'm looking at is patent activity, and that's critical for economic growth. But it's also, there's another cautionary tale in my research, and that's in the prediction. The prediction is that you should try to stop the first lynching because the others have less of an effect. They have an effect, but they have less of an effect. So you should stop the first incidence of violence if at all possible, because that's the one that is most costly to society and to invention and innovation. And for this period, that would suggest making sure that the police who are engaging in this behavior are being held accountable. It would suggest that the report on white supremacist groups and white nationalist groups that was suppressed in 2009, that was written by Homeland Security, that report needs to be widely circulated so that law enforcement agencies can get this out of control infusion of neo-Nazis and white supremacist groups under control.
How serious is the current social unrest in the US, and what are the implications? Just, I think, yesterday, a police taping became public where, officers were heard saying unspeakable things, using racial slurs, and essentially, literally saying, let's start a civil war. I mean, it's unbelievable. Do you think this could get a lot more serious?
I certainly think it can, given, again, this infiltration that was documented in 2009 by Homeland Security, and John Boehner and Rand Paul suppressed the circulation of it. And now, I think it was last year, 2019, if not 2018, that news outlets were reporting that the FBI felt powerless against these white nationalist groups that had infiltrated the military, the police, and other groups. So, if we got behind on that, that needs to be a priority, because otherwise it's not. That's a systemic part. Otherwise, that's not going to stop if these police are not held accountable. If different tactics aren't used, I think that these problems will fester, and we really need to look for permanent solutions. This is a national shame. We should really address these root causes and these newish factors.
Would you be optimistic under President Trump that things would really be changing?
I'm not sure that under the current leadership I would be optimistic, just because he's given these groups aid and comfort. So I don't see this turning around under his leadership. And certainly I would, nobody wants another civil war, so I'm hoping that the forces of reason and democracy continue to resurface.
Well, that makes two of us. Which policy measures do you think should be enacted to lessen inequality?
I don't mean to continue to repeat my suggestion, but because I work on hate crimes related to this other work, I would put that as a priority to address hate crimes and the white nationalist groups and their influence in American society. Another proposal would be to address the roots of the racial wealth gap. The racial wealth gap is a symptom of systemic racism, so that needs to be addressed. And I would say that is of the utmost urgency. That is one of the most urgent problems to address the racial wealth gap. There's, in Boston, just as an example, an average black family has $8 in net worth, and the average white family has roughly $250,000 in net worth. And if you're thinking about weathering a storm like COVID-19, let's say you have to quickly move to another location or support a household with 2 or 3 jobs lost, $8 isn't going to do it. And that's what we're asking of people in this country. And I think that is also a national shame.
Most definitely. How can a corporation contribute to counteract the lack of diversity? I mean, for the longest time, this is a slightly different topic, but they have been called on including more women in their ranks. And at the top level, you see hardly any of them. I have spent my professional life on Wall Street and really haven't encountered that many people of color. So what can corporations do?
They can start acknowledging it. Because I find same thing in economics, that people got very comfortable talking about gender and collecting data on gender, but they feel uncomfortable collecting data on race. In economics, and I can imagine in corporations as well, built on economic principles and on profit maximization, would suffer the same fate if there weren't diversity, and diversity of lived experience, not just diversity of thought, not just diversity of gender, but also of race. And I think that if, there are firms in Silicon Valley that have gotten it right, there are universities that have gotten it right, there are examples out there. So I think that we can do more to diversify, the portfolio management ranks. I was at Solomon Brothers in stock research, so equity research rooms, bond research rooms, all ranks, and leadership of these firms.
Isn't the track record of Silicon Valley particularly shocking? I don't have the numbers in front of me, but isn't the rate of African Americans like 3%? And one of the big ones,
yeah.
I want to say Facebook didn't have anybody in their senior ranks?
I wouldn't be surprised. I think 2 to 3%, from my research, 2 to 3%. And senior management seems to be about right. And that's, a workforce that is often 1 to 2% of the workforce, but it's hard to tell. Often data are obfuscated to hide this problem. So there have been a lot of pledges to do better. So there's a lot to watch out for. Google said that it was going to increase its senior ranks of African Americans by 30%. So they're starting from a very low base. I think right now it's 2.6%, or 2 point something percent. And I think that it's not going to take much to increase that by a third.
Exactly.
But I think that's a fairly modest goal.
How can the brittle social...
So there are a lot of problems there. There are a lot of problems there, and I think that in the proposals that I put forward recently, I've emphasized workplace climate, and I've emphasized that for women and for African American women and for all women, getting rid of the arbitration clause, the forced arbitration clause, with respect to sexual harassment. My sense is that any kind of harassment that faces forced arbitration is not good. I think it was Oracle that was just fined by the EEOC, I believe, for underpaying women and minorities, like $400 million. So I think that the workplace climate issues related to pay and promotion especially have to be addressed if we're going to say that the pipeline is critical for outcomes. And we've got to say something about where the pipeline is broken, and it's with respect to workplace climate.
It's really difficult to be optimistic looking, for instance, at remuneration for women who are still making a lot less than men, and this has been in the headlines and been discussed and criticized so much, and nothing much has changed, at least not significantly. And I would think with regard to African Americans is probably even more dramatic, the difference.
That's right, but I would say that I've probably been collecting recent data for 10 years, and in that 10 years, the ratio has changed. The ratio of median salaries for men and women and for African Americans and whites, that's the gap. The gap is closing. It's not widening, but it is closing ever so modestly. So in that sense, I am optimistic. But that's just one measure. That's just one measure, and that's the one that is easiest. One of the ones that's easiest to collect. But there's still very few, as we're talking about, Of course, the innovation economy is wider than tech firms, but certainly at tech firms, especially at the commercialization end, say for IPOs, we don't see any African Americans among the the most valuable tech firms, and of the 10 richest people in the world, 7 of them are connected in some way to a tech firm, and that completely leaves African Americans out.
Mm. I think this lack of diversity is also partially, at least, responsible for the brittle social fabric in the U.S. How do you think that can be fortified?
I think the first thing is acknowledgement. And I think that we're in a period of education and acknowledgement, but certainly education and acknowledgement have to be followed by action, by action that is sacrificed. I mean, if I'm thinking about my relatives and myself and the civil rights movement, myself as a much, as a very young person. But if I'm thinking about my older relatives, there was real sacrifice. They faced death threats, and in my extended family, they were certainly killed. So I would say that we've got to, that kind of progress, that kind of fundamental change requires commitment that is deep and requires sacrifice that is significant. And it requires everyone in the society to pull together to make this change. I'm amazed at how people keep saying that that white people are taking part in some of the Black Lives Matter marches. If you look at the pictures of the civil rights movement or look at the pictures of the freedom riders, there were white people taking part in these, and they heard the moral calling. Viola Lucio, who is from Detroit, the nurse from Detroit who died in the civil rights movement. I mean, they heard the call. So it's going to take all of us, and it's going to take deep commitment. It can't be superficial. It can't be one summer. It can't be one march. And it's got to be deep commitment, because when the fabric starts fraying for one part of society, starts fraying for the other. I think we fundamentally don't understand or have not admitted how interconnected we are and how intertwined we are as Americans. I think certain forces in our society have tried to convince us that we are not that intertwined. We might be quite segregated, that's true, but we are quite intertwined as a society and as an economy.
I agree. How do you think these societal biases and prejudices can be addressed and changed? Because there have been a lot of these Karen instances lately where, white middle-aged women have been taped because they, it's hard to, I'll explain it in the German part, but you know what I mean. How can these
sure.
prejudices be addressed? They seem to be so ingrained.
Right. So I think that the first part of that still is acknowledgement, and the second part is education. What I understand from recent analysis, and I haven't read these studies myself, haven't read this research, but it seems as though the top shows on television often give the impression, whether they're sort of reality TV or they are the lionized versions of reality TV. Cops have a certain role, and this some people believe that they have this right and this privilege, and others don't share in that right and privilege. So I think the popular media and television have something to do with this. So in that sense, I'm glad the show Cops was canceled. And I would hope that other such shows that glorify a particular person, in this case, in the case you're mentioning, white woman calling the cops on a bad black guy, that has dangerous consequences. And I think this incident in Central Park with the birder, with the two Coopers, Christian Cooper and Amy Cooper, I think that highlighted how dangerous it is for white women to call the cops on a black man. That's been an age-old situation of danger. That was a danger that Emmett Till faced. Right? It typically does not end as well as that situation ended. So we're certainly grateful for that, but we're also grateful for camera phones and national discussion about this. And I think that discussion continues. As you know, there's this whole sort of debate on Twitter about the term Karen, and I think there's been an education of a lot of people with respect to that term, and white women who are marching in Black Lives Matter protests, calling themselves Karen and calling themselves out. So I think that is the beginning of recognition of how powerful their voices can be and how they might be redirected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. So having said all that, what's your outlook for the U.S. economy, especially taking into account the upcoming elections?
So that's interesting. That seems to be so far down my list of factors. The first thing on my list is COVID-19. Like, this is what affects the economy is the health of the American people. And the virus will determine that. And their behavior, the behavior of the American people will determine that and determine how long it's going to be around, how long it's going to be a major factor.
Sorry. I just answered the question exactly the same way in a talk show like you did. But how do you think that this crisis is being managed? And do you have faith in people that they will? I mean, there's this ridiculous discussion about wearing masks right now.
There is. And I believe that, first of all, I'm shocked. I'm really shocked. I was saying that we are really intertwined with one another, and I think some people refuse to believe that. And I think that the proof will be in the pudding, because now states that have opened up have just ordered bars closed, for example, and I think they're going to have to take the step of ordering people. Every state is going to have to take the step of ordering people to wear masks, and then they're going to have to start providing masks, because one thing that happens whenever a new law like that is passed, the burden of compliance often falls on black and brown people, and they're policed more with respect to compliance. So I would hope that there would be more thought about how to implement such policies systematically. But I think that's what it's going to take. I mean, we've seen this, a rise, new highs, new record highs in a number of places. And we're seeing these in red states. So I think that's where your question about the election comes in. If the first wave really hit urban areas and, heavily populated states, and now it's moving, and certainly in Michigan, it's moving to more rural areas and rural parts of the state. I think that there will be more consideration, more thought given to, and possibly more empathy for those victims of this of COVID-19, because it is moving in these places, and I would hope. This shouldn't be politicized. It absolutely shouldn't be politicized. One of the things that I draw inspiration from. It's a somewhat unlikely thing, but I live in the home that Jonas Salk lived in. And I can only imagine, the developer of the polio vaccine, and I can only imagine how difficult it was and how much fear and how much hope was surrounding his discovery and his implementation of that vaccine. And I would just hope that there is one on the horizon soon. But people were wearing masks and taking precautions at that time to the extent they could. And the same was true for the Spanish flu. So in that sense, I am hopeful, and I really wish that this had not become politicized, because people's lives are at stake. And COVID-19 doesn't know whether you're a Democrat or Republican.
Very true. Well, on this hopeful note, many thanks for joining us today, Lisa. Your insights have been absolutely eye-opening. And since we're all part of the system, like you said, we hopefully can all and will all contribute, even in small parts, to make it a more inclusive, fair, and equitable system.
Indeed, indeed.
Thank you, Lisa.
Pleasure's all mine.
Bye-bye.